Thank you all for being here, and it's an honor and a privilege, and now an extra honor and privilege that it's the fall talk for the Baha'i Center. I want to thank Hoda for inviting me and Kate for organizing everything so perfectly, and thank you all for coming back after dinner, which is not an easy thing to do. So my talk is Good Childhood, Social Childhood, and the question I want to pursue here is how to think about good. What do we mean by good in a kind of non-plain vanilla way, but still in a broad and expansive way? So it's too easy to be banal or culturally blinkered regarding good, what we mean, like what's a good. There's all kinds of assumptions, some of which we've heard about today, critically heard about. This thing is beeping. And it's perhaps a little bit easier to talk about what we mean by a bad childhood or an ugly childhood, but maybe not so much either. So I want to offer some basic principles for defining and ensuring good childhoods, and thus, and this is part of my point, good adulthoods. And every time I say good, it's in quotes, so I'll stop doing that. And I want to draw on the theoretical framework of social reproduction. And say that social reproduction, what is social reproduction? I'm not going to read you the slide, but social reproduction is all about how a social formation is reproduced, how the labor force is reproduced, how the knowledge that's involved in production is produced and reproduced, how the social relations of production and reproduction are made and what holds them together. And obviously there's a global and intimate aspect to this and everything in between. And social reproduction involves the fleshy, messy stuff of everyday life, as well as a set of structured practices. And those two things are held in tension. And the spaces of childhood are key to, well, I don't think that leapt ahead, right? I've hardly ever used this. So the geographies of social reproduction are, this doesn't show where it is. That's why I'm not touching that computer again. The geographies of social reproduction shift among the household, capital, or the workplace, the state, and civil society, and it's always some combination of those, and it's always a sort of social struggle in who is providing that, and is now under a lot of change as a result of global economic restructuring. There's not a commitment by capital to particular places, and therefore there's a sort of offloading of what used to be a kind of commitment to socially reproducing a labor force in place, and now is left down, sort of offloaded to individuals and households. The part of social reproduction is the means of existence. And as the term implies, these are elemental to social life and its successful, healthy reproduction. Often, what I'm calling means of existence are called basic needs, goods, and services. But since I include the broad questions of social justice as key to social reproduction, I prefer the terminology of means of existence. Without social justice, there's not going to be healthy social reproduction. Included in that is the basic needs of food, water, shelter, clothing, care, that is nurturing, health, protection, love, learning, justice, respect, dignity, and self-possession. It's important to recognize the ways that these are not guaranteed in any setting, and of course war and violence are antithetical to ensuring healthy social reproduction and security in the deepest sense of the word. But for my purposes tonight, I want to recognize the ways neoliberal capitalist globalization or global economic restructuring have made these means of existence even more elusive and precarious for more and more children. They obviously work differently across the global north and south, across class, across race and gender. But the imperatives of neoliberal capitalism sieved through the historical geographies of imperialism and racism and the global, local, intimate dynamics of sexism and heterosexism have made social reproduction more precarious, reducing and cutting big holes in the safety nets that were associated with social welfare states and the social wage that came of labor struggles, that came of community struggles around family and care, and also the mutual aid and support associated with kin networks and community solidarities. In the global north, the means of existence, which are never guaranteed, however necessary, even though that might sound contradictory, there's always a sort of, as we know, there are people who are struggling to just achieve like bare survival. But these means of existence have been privatized, increasingly privatized, commodified, and offloaded, as I mentioned before, from the state and from the workplace to households and individuals, which experience this vulnerability and its challenges differently, but generally in ways that make the achievement of good childhood more difficult and make what I'm calling social childhood more vulnerable. So I'm going to draw on my work with children and about childhood in Sudan and in the US and elsewhere over the past 30 years to illustrate what's at stake in these intimate and global struggles. I'm going to be particularly attentive to the historical geographies and spatialities of good childhood, but also its temporalities, its beings and becomings, as Daphne mentioned this morning. If these means of existence are the bedrock of good childhood, what takes root and grows in those grounds is equally and profoundly part of the good, which I think and hope in its basic openness is a shared one. This is an adventure playground, something that you can hardly ever see now in the United States due to the preoccupation with children's safety. Though they built one with great fanfare on Governor's Island, so you have to take a subway or a bus and a boat to get there, to have your adventure. But anyway, I digress. As part of a good childhood, it's also important to recognize and foster several things that I want to mention briefly. Sociality. Children are part of multiple communities of practice in which they share knowledge, that both learning and teaching of what it means to be a member. This is I guess it says it's a plaza in Vienna, where there's a cafe, where there's young people hanging around, where there are children playing, and they're all part of this community. The idea of communities of practice was developed by Jean Lave and Etienne Wenger to designate a shared and fluid field of learning and practice in which all participants are engaged in exchanges of knowledge, and as the community of those who share a particular body of knowledge expands, older knowers can leave the community and it remains stable, fluid and changing and thriving, but stable. Its modes of practice are more horizontal than hierarchical, and learning and knowing are embodied, they are engaged with others and the material world. In the course of participation, participants change, as does the community and its collective knowledge and practice. Of a piece with these communities of practice, children are part of multiple and differentiated webs of care, familial, communal, local, and global, that not only see to their well-being, but in their everyday material social practices enable all kinds of exchanges and mutual aid, care, respect, and love. Any notion of good childhood is a profoundly social one, which should call into question not only the achievement of good at the expense of others' childhoods, but also those accomplished through private means and the enclosures associated with them that willfully and otherwise obscure the social questions at stake. Oh, this goes with the community, the mutual aid, and there is a gorgeous playground in New York, cut off from even its own community, it appears. As environmental historian Wes Jackson said regarding the preservation and care of wilderness environments, we will not succeed in preserving the so-called pristine wilderness unless we equally love and care for places like East St. Louis and other urban pockets of deep and woeful disinvestment and dispossession and neglect. Likewise, we cannot achieve good childhood in the deepest sense if it requires so many children left behind and wasted through dispossession, alienation, violence, and incarceration. One of the most moving talks I ever saw was by Wole Soyinka, the brilliant Nigerian novelist, writer, who talked about the loss of generations of creativity in Africa with wars and violence. And he said might be easy to say, oh, what's that? But that loss of all those minds, of all that potential, is a tragedy now on a world scale. And that's what I'm talking about in a different way, about the kind of hiving off of certain people's successful childhoods at the expense of a larger group of people who are left behind, and a growing number of people who are left behind. Another part of the good, that was sociality, is respect. That is a recognition that children are competent and capable, communicative social actors. A recognition of their rights to privacy. They can control access to their bodies, their spaces, selves, knowledge, including having secrets and solitude. Another part of the good is security, forgive the word since it's also associated with the homeland. But let's return the idea of security to something that recognizes the security of rather than a security to. Something like this, which was in some tabloid a few years ago, really produces a panic around such tactics about fear, about producing the other, the vulnerability of children. And that's overblown to the point of ridiculousness. And it evacuates the material social practices and values that it would aspire to achieve a good childhood as a profoundly social concern. So again, this would include the security of social reproduction, care, nutrition, shelter, and restoration daily and over the long term, the security of health and well-being and the protection from harm, the security of thinking and learning, imagining and doing in everyday and specialized environments. In addition, any notion of good childhood includes recognition that life, children's and everyone else's, is a process of becoming, learning, being, doing in multiple and fluid ways and settings. While becoming is especially marked in childhood, so too is being, which has its intrinsic pleasures, and the distinction was marked by Daphne this morning. And this might be the only conference that has two pictures of people with buckets on their heads, because that was in Fruma's lullaby pictures. But this is a kid in Sudan getting water, but on the way decided to put the bucket on her head because there are intrinsic pleasures. There's playfulness, there's joy, there's creativity, that's a car, and a hat, homemade, and opportunities and the requisite time space to exercise and stretch both physical and social competence. That means places that are not overprotected or corralled, as a growing number of children's spaces are. This is in Central Park, and obviously open to children playing outside of the box. Encouraging and respecting children's capacities for rulemaking and rule breaking, which is a way of learning governance in the course of everyday life. When my son was in junior high and in a band, they had this list of rules. The favorite of all the adults was no fake quitting. And when you think about it, that's like a great rule. When people get temperamental and I quit. So no fake quitting. And that's part of what you learn in the course of a social, sociality and social life. Learning cooperation and disagreements, and a time of the pleasures of imagination, and what I have, after Walter Benjamin, called mimesis, or the mimetic faculty, where playing at something, making believe, being a truck, being a princess, is a way of understanding that we make up our lives, that we make our subjectivities, we make worlds, and we could make them differently. And that's a powerful sort of recognition. And also self-making and self-organization as the grounds of civil society. And here are children in Sudan playing with, one of the major things I contributed to this village was garbage. And it was all well used in games. This is store. But, once I gave a talk about, this is years ago, about children's play, and this guy said, "You're so romantic. You just romanticize it. And kids are bullies, and kids are mean, and kids are, violent." And I said, "Yeah, all those things." And they learn to negotiate it. And he said, "When I was a kid, kids paid me to negotiate, like the fights they had." And I said, "And what do you do now?" And he said, "I'm a lawyer." So I said, well, I think I'm right then. We learn these sorts of practices in our childhood play. So each of these material social practices has a historical geography and associated spaces, raising questions around what constitutes safe space, but also engaging spaces for being and becoming. Spaces of stimuli and opportunities to do and make and manipulate things. Spaces to share one's ideas and learn from others, both young and old. Spaces that are challenging but also safe in a broad sense, that is socially protected and accessible to children. And what that might mean varies according to children's ages and the context in which they're growing up. But they're usually broader than we imagine. Not enclosed spaces, but open and integrated into surrounding social fabric, whether city, country, or suburb. Not like that. You see how interesting that is for the whole community. But more like that same plaza in Vienna. And so finally, some examples from my work that trace some of the spatialities of good and maybe not so good childhoods as ways to understand the global, the intimate, and the intimate in the global. I worked for over 15 years on and off in rural Sudan. It was a poor place. There was no electricity. There was no running water. There was intermittent clean water from the artesian wells there. So people's health was compromised. There was very low school enrollment, yet I found that children there had what I call good childhoods. Their work, play, and learning were connected in time, space, and meaning. While these kids were working in the field planting sorghum and then ran off to the side with a few sorghum seeds to make a bird trap. And they kept paying attention to whether birds were alighting on the seeds so they could pull that trap over. This child is playing, and he played this all the time, variations on this, fields. So he also worked in the fields, but he also played this in miniature. And these kids played subsistence fields and tenancies. So they were also internalizing the kind of political economic transformation in their village. And these are shepherds making breakfast out of some roots that they found that they look for in the rainy season. So work and play are fused in their everyday lives. Children also worked autonomously as apprentices of sorts, and as assistants in communities of practice that were still vibrant and encompassed their extended families, friends, and co-residents. So they assist elders or are kind of guided by other adults in getting water from the riverbed. Children were seen as responsible and were respected as such, even as they were supervised or monitored by adults or older children. Children were part of the charm and pleasure of everyday life. When I ask somebody why they have children, because they make you laugh, which they do. They also make you cry. But they were at least on the fringes of most adult conversations, but also they were treasured as comic relief and helpmeets to everyone's daily grind. So here's someone making fun of me, making a joke out of what was always in front of my face. The space of their childhoods were expansive. By about 10 years of age, and often younger, boys and girls had access to virtually all of the area surrounding the village that they could get to in about a 2-hour walk. They were untethered to their homes. They were unsurveilled by their parents, and they were largely unsupervised, except in a Jane Jacobs sense of like eyes on the street, eyes on the woods. So they're gathering these fronds that they burn and make into ash that thickens stew. And indeed, girls in this, let me go back to the girl, in this Islamic community had a broader access to the outdoor environment than their peers in New York City and other parts of the global north. So we might complicate Purda then and think about ways that fear produces more restrictions on girls' mobility than official Purda, which is so maligned by people in the global north. I'm not saying I love it, but I think we need to look at the everyday experiences of young women and girls. The surrounding environment was seen and was safe and offered a great variety of resources that were great for all manner of work, play, and exploration. But there were problems, of course, and part of the way we see them has to do with the time space of childhood as a time of becoming, but also in particular and always changing, sometimes profoundly, historical geographies. The children where I worked were learning vibrantly and wonderfully how to carry on the work of their community. But the means for them to continue that work as they came of age, and this is something that's in my book, were under erasure thanks to limited access to land because of the land tenure relations associated with this agricultural project, the deforestation in the area, the devegetation of pasture areas, and the encroachment of commodification of things that were formerly free or freely held, which led to an increased need for cash that led to having to work more. And actually, school enrollment during the early years of the project decreased relatively because children's labor was needed more. And that was a development project. So all the vibrant learning and knowing I saw and documented, I feared might have nowhere to go. So I frame this as Dskilling, which is one of the intimate forms of global processes when they come home to roost. So that's the kind of environment in which they're growing up. So here I ask, what does that shift have to do with the goodness of the childhoods these children lived? Does the wrench of time make them less good in retrospect? Should any childhood's goodness be reckoned in terms of fitness for the future? On the New York subway. Wouldn't that make the experience of childhood only something that is becoming rather than being, only looking to the future and the sort of self-making that is imagined to embody it successfully, while at the same time privileging stability of a social formation, a stability that might really mean stuckness as the arena, the only kind of arena of a good childhood? And isn't this precisely not a good way to imagine good childhood? So I want to understand the notion of overlapping communities of practice as fluid and flexible learning, doing, being, and mark the ways that I was right yet wrong in imagining Sudanese children's deskilling and its consequences. What I found when I returned to Sudan, when these children who had been 10 years old when I initially worked there were in their early 20s, I found responses that I characterized on a continuum from resilience to resistance. For example, one extraordinary thing I discovered when I returned was that what I called time-space expansion. David Harvey, a very well-known Marxist geographer, talks about time-space compression, which is the experience of rapid communication, the internet, jet travel, etc. If you're wealthy, the world has indeed compressed. But if you're not, the time and space that it takes for you to eke out a living has grown. And so what happened in this village was that they still grazed animals, they still farmed, and they still cut firewood, but they did this in distances up to 200 kilometers from the village, so that the area, in order to stay in place, increased by, it's some crazy number, but by 1,500 times as large. That's the only statistic I have, if you could call it that. But by expanding the area of work activities that had taken place within 5 kilometers of the village, young people were not sort of pushed out of the countryside into the cities that would have a hard time absorbing them and for which they had few skills that would have enabled them to succeed there. Obviously, this can't last forever, but it was quite an interesting form of resilience. At the same time, it was sutured to what I called reworking. And that was reworking the culture of education. When I first went there, 4% of the school-age girls were in school. And in the intervening 15 years, they had hired, through self-help money, which all came from selling sugar, which is another story that I won't get into, but massive amounts of sugar produced enough money to hire women teachers so that there could be girls' education. Darwin would be happy. And that's from the morning talk. I realize people are here who weren't here. And then they were in the process of building a secondary school in the village. So there was this very rapid, under 15-year recognition that the old things that children were learning were not going to work for them, and that there needed to be a new way of organizing social and cultural and economic life. And so this idea around education expanded. And when I went back, when the kids, 15 years later or 10 years later, 42% of the girls of school age were in school. And that's just extraordinary. This is not like passive steamroller of capitalism takes over your life and renders you helpless. So I found that my sort of pessimistic sense that deskilling was happening was unfounded. And I thought it was quite remarkable that there was this whole new relationship to education. The third R is resistance, and that I'm not going to talk about, but it was mostly in relation to religion, not fundamentalism, but Sufi spiritualism, and in relation to mothers resisting the conscription of their sons into the army and the militias. And the government had made it so that you could not get a high school certificate, diploma, if you didn't sign up for the draft. You could not get a visa to go to the Gulf states if you didn't serve in the Army. So mothers prevented their sons from getting diplomas in order for them not to go to the Army, and that was the main kind of resistance during that time. So what I saw and framed as Dskilling in Sudan, I also saw in New York, especially among urban working class kids of color, as New York City was disinvested and deindustrialized and made the proving grounds of neoliberal capitalism after the fiscal crisis of the 1970s. What I focused on in New York were the state and corporate disinvestments in the social wage, in public education, in public play spaces, in public housing, and the kinds of childhood spaces they produced. The commitment to sustaining and training a new generation of a differentiated labor force was dampened with the flight of production to lower cost cities in the US and then further afield. Capitalists were able to take advantage of labor forces reproduced elsewhere in the older industrial centers and in the settings where they shifted production. Left to languish were young people coming of age, particularly non-white working class and poor young people, whose spaces of everyday life suffered from disinvestment. The neglect and disinvestment led to public spaces that were constituted as unsafe because of their physical degradation. Here's a daycare center, fabulous play space. By fear of crime disproportionate to its occurrence, which evacuated many public environments, rendering them actually dangerous, and by a growing collective determination, which we heard something about this morning, to keep children safe from everything at all costs. Not coincidentally for municipalities and their designers, the costs that they were avoiding were litigious costs. But there was also the kind of protection of children. And among parents, especially privileged ones, the latter has been part of a shift that all too often shapes childhood as something that I've snidely referred to as getting from birth to Harvard without a boo-boo. And the conjured razor blade apples are part of this sort of panic. This, your children are not safe anywhere, is part of this panic. And speaking of Halloween, this sentiment was hilariously represented here by a friend of mine's son in his Halloween costume as Bubble Boy, protected at all costs from everything and anything. During this time, I focused on a variety of playgrounds and other open spaces in parks, housing developments, and schools as less and less accessible due to poor maintenance, neglect, lack of programming, and thus parental restrictions on children's access to the outdoor environment, and therefore everyday engagements with their friends. I did a study of 2 schoolyards on 112th Street in central Harlem, 2 blocks from Central Park, and the children, 12 years old, were not allowed to go to Central Park. You know, this wasted play, amazing play environment and natural environment, constructed natural environment. And when accessible, often their sheer tedium, such as this sort of banal playground, I apologize for that slide, which was not really changed since the 1930s. That was certainly, I didn't grow up in the 1930s, but that's the kind of playground that was around when I was growing up in the Bronx in the 1950s, and that's still there. That would discourage engagement. And while playground improvements after the 1970s offered physical, colorful changes that were more focused on play, they were more focused on play safety than anything else, that haunting of the boo-boo. That did little to invite the sort of creative wonder and open-ended engagement that creative designers and planners envisioned and achieved in the 1960s and 70s. Just this week, there was an interview in the Urban Omnibus published by the Architectural League of New York that was all about these adventure playgrounds, or these well-designed playgrounds in middle-class and working-class housing developments and around schools. But those were all changed. There really are no kind of certainly no adventure playgrounds, which use spare parts and loose parts, and were more open-ended and interesting for kids. Interesting playgrounds were few but fabulous, and many of them were undermined by these same safety fears that increasingly have characterized children's lives in the US, but also elsewhere. These fears limit children's prospects for autonomy, shared culture and identity formation, serendipity, self-governance, all the things I was talking about before, and interesting expanses for doing nothing. I'm a big advocate of doing nothing. I think most of you were kids. I would assume in any language there's the form of this question. Where'd you go? Out. What did you do? Nothing. And who's going to say what that nothing entailed? But that is a vibrant source of creative activity or engagement or experiment or testing one's limits, almost getting in trouble, getting hurt, and in the vast majority of cases, not getting seriously hurt or dying. But this is to say nothing of the over-policing of the streets and sidewalks and public spaces of the city that targets young men of color and severely restricts their safe access and secure interactions in the public environments of New York and elsewhere. And if someone wins the presidency, it will be everywhere. But we're not going to go there. Thanks to global political economic processes that were of a piece with those taking place in Sudan, the intimate geographies of children and teens in New York shrunk, were deracinated, and were increasingly surveilled. Not the makings of good childhood, though I learned from Sudan, as I learned from Sudan, from the children with whom I worked, who quite literally made worlds out of debris, as you saw in that game of store. This is, of course, neither to romanticize the capacity nor advocate putting children to that test, but to gesture toward the mimetic quality of children's play and imagination, which I'm going to get to in a couple minutes in my conclusion, and to avoid the kind of middle-class hysteria about what makes a childhood good. And so I turned to that hysteria. When I initially worked in the neighborhoods of profound disinvestment in New York, I was struck by the way more privileged households were able to blunt, if not completely negate, the effects of these disinvestments in the social wage, and what amounted to social childhood was rapidly eroding. Their private solutions, child care workers, nannies, private schools, fee-based after-school activities and oases, summer camps, not only exacerbated the differences in childhood and its expectations among wealthier and poorer families in the city, but also took the middle class itself out of sort of pressuring the city to make good schools, to make good, safe playgrounds, interesting kind of public spaces. Rather than fight that fight, people remove themselves from the fight by taking care of it, by paying for it. And those changes enabled the further degradation of the other spaces. Political questions and would-be political responses were siphoned off into private and privatized solutions, managing the crisis rather than confronting it, which entailed increasingly managing children's lives. Some kids' good childhoods were being secured at the expense of others' bad or wasted or compromised childhoods. Moreover, neither group was necessarily experiencing something so good. Recall my earlier caution regarding the importance of social childhood in the making of any good childhood. So here, safety, safety, safety. You can hardly trip over the parents there. These concerns about the privileged securing of childhood led me to my current work, which I'm only going to mention because I'm running out of time, Childhood as Spectacle, in which I'm looking at contemporary childhood refracted through and in response to the provocations of ontological insecurity, which I always feel the need to say is abbreviated OI. And so that's what it feels like. It's an insecurity around the environment, an insecurity around political economy, an insecurity about geopolitical relations, and there's plenty of reasons to feel insecure, but the way to address it has really been about managing your body, managing your space, and in my case, what I'm looking at is managing your child, right to the bone. So I associate different figures of the child and children's experience with this notion of childhood, including the child as accumulation strategy, the child as commodity, the child as ornament, and the one that drives all of those three, the child as waste, and the managing of that waste. Obviously, I can't discuss this in detail here, but I want to mark the parenting and material social practices I've been studying, which I associate with the sort of securing of childhood in times experienced as woefully and frighteningly insecure. These practices are all too often antithetical to the intentions of world peace, as presented by Hoda this morning. Potential political responses that these circumstances call forth are drained into personal, privatized practices that are disciplining of parents in a Foucauldian sense. I mean, people are busy driving children everywhere and standing in playgrounds. They're talking, but they still have to be there. And resources are packed into certain children who won't necessarily succeed because of this, but have a better chance, while others scramble to grow up in that fraught terrain. Social childhood has come to mean other people's children, and securing their well-being appears to be of little interest to those in power or even within individual communities. A colleague of mine is studying the schools on the Upper West Side. One school has, the way that it's divided, has much wealthier, resource-filled parents who have contributed lots to the school, and one has mostly poor children, and there was a discussion about sharing the resources across the two schools, and she said that was the only time in her research and political life that she was actually scared because of the response of the parents in the well-endowed school. So even within a community, there's a resistance to the social childhood. Rather, the safety of those who are more privileged seems increasingly predicated on the management of those pushed out as waste, whether through policies like stop and frisk, incarceration, or military conscription. Recognizing the intensity of the connection between children as accumulation strategies, commodities, or ornaments, and children as waste is crucial to reimagining and remaking social childhood, a childhood that aspires to be good for all, as utopian as that might sound and be. So just to wrap this up, this project requires an invigorated political imagination, one that I think is of a piece with what I talked about as a mimesis, drawing on Walter Benjamin's notion of mimesis, in which children pretend they're this, that, or the other thing, and engage in dramatic play. They understand themselves to be making up their subjectivities and creating whole worlds. And that in understanding this, there's the possible flash of recognition that the world, themselves, and the conditions in which they make their lives could be different. Though, of course, it usually isn't in any profound way. Nevertheless, that flash of recognition lies coiled in each of us and is a reservoir for a political imagination that recognizes that we, collectively, could remake the world, or at least chip away at the conditions that make that world so difficult for so many. And here, I just want to say that it seems useful to take a leaf from what I found in Sudan, not in the specifics of their resilience or reworking, but in the aspirational horizon of social childhood. Faced with foreclosing possibilities for their children to reproduce the conditions that would enable them to continue the social relations of production and reproduction of their village, the community drew upon their resources and gathered new ones to outfit their children, all of their children, for the new conditions that faced them. They did not bunker themselves and make their children to make sure that their children made it. They hired new teachers, built a new school, took advantage of new hand pumps that freed children's labor time to go to school. Whether their strategies would be successful in the future was not the point. It was that their strategies were focused on collectivity, not individuality. And so to conclude, I want to show a few images of the sorts of public environments for children that might make good on that aspiration in New York. And forget that. And I'm just going to breeze through these. In my work, I've developed the idea of countertypography, which I think speaks to the themes of this conference around children in an interconnected world. By countertypography, I mean that there are places that are connected by virtue of a relationship to something. In my case here, Dskilling. Places that on the surface seem very different, but that have contour lines that connect them, and might inform the kind of practice that's appropriate or inspiring in each place. Tracing this contour line between rural Sudan and New York suggests new political possibilities and connections that might enable good social childhoods that cross time, space, scale, and nation, and reduce the bunkering and inequality that increasingly characterize our lives and thwart our political aspirations. Thank you.
Thank you so much for that informative talk and about reminding us about our collective responsibility towards children. I would like to now open the floor to entertain questions from the floor. There'll be microphones that are provided to you, and I request that you ask a question because that way we save time. Questions?
This is going to be a really obnoxious question.
Obnoxious?
Obnoxious.
Okay.
Yeah. What's so extraordinary about this talk is your capacity to show and to feel children's lives left alone to be imagined and created by them. How do you get that way? To be able to see, this is the obnoxious part. This is the obnoxious part about to come up. How you have this extraordinary sensibility in every way, and I want to know how it is you understand that you came to this way of looking at the world of children.
I don't think that's obnoxious.
Oh.
I have to.
So they can hear you.
For one thing, I really think that I am totally in touch with my own childhood in a way that, of course, seems perfectly normal to me. But now that I'm like almost 100 years old, I recognize is not common. You know, like I really can remember how it felt, or I remember what I said, or I remember just little things. So I think that I really have an affinity to children. I mean, somebody said, I don't think it was me, but yet we study what we want to be. And I think it's not like I didn't want to grow up. I did, and I have. But I feel this real connection. Also, I love the ethnographic experience. And I really am sort of pained. I think the reason I haven't finished this book on childhood as spectacle is that I haven't been with children. It's more with parents. It's more looking at blog. You know, it doesn't feel like the real thing. So that part of it is that kind of ethnographic sense of being. And in that, I think what makes me a good ethnographer, if I can say that, is that I'm totally in the present, so that I'm there. it makes me sort of a bad friend, because when I'm with you, I'm totally with you, and I'm going to call you tomorrow, and then I say goodbye, and then I'm in the next present. So there's just a way that I'm in that world when I'm in it. I don't know if that answers it, but...
It does.
Okay.
Over here?
I'm struck by the current day with the helicopter parents, how do you take what you've learned from your studies and kind of put it into action or spread the word? What kinds of things are you doing? Or, how do we make it so that more than 10 people read the book? That kind of thing. How do we put it in action?
I don't know. Because that is the problem. And that's the problem with, it's a funny thing when you do this kind of work. It's like, because I give talks to non-academic audiences. One of the parts of the project has been watching Race to Nowhere in the audiences where there's talk back. And it's like doing work on gentrification, where all of us might be gentrifiers, but so there's this squirmy guilt, like, sorry, I don't do, people are like, I'm not that kind of mother. I'm not, and there's a kind of guilt about it, rather than, I'm not into shaming people about what they do or how they are as parents. I'm interested in what motivates this and what that insecurity is that has led to this form of response, that why the politics around social reproduction is addressed through this sort of removal from the social, and this, at least among privileged people, and not just among privileged people, managing children. And so that's not an answer, because I don't know how to reach people in that way. Like I sometimes, there's popular books by Skenazy, like that say, let your kid take the subway. And I sometimes think if someone would just blow a whistle and say, all children go outside now, and then the streets would be safe in the way that they were in the 1950s. I mean, I played outside. I'm sure most of you did, those of you who are older, wherever you were growing up. And my danger is that I have the halcyon Fordist capitalist days, and that wasn't great either. But there was a kind of autonomy, and how to encourage it. One of my colleagues works with the Parks Department, and he also works with the UN on child-friendly cities and doing the design and development. Sorry. But I don't feel like I'm engaged in that work, and I feel bad about that. No shame. I'm not ashamed.
What were you going to say, Anne?
Well, it's almost Halloween, so we gotta get at. We don't want to all line up to get our candy X-rayed for, and I understand that same paranoia, but I also know that, like, I went out until the streetlights came on, and then you had to come home, and you would just be out for hours doing nothing, I guess. And you're right.
No, it was great.
There's an innocence lost there.
And I think it really, I think I could do, when I first had the idea of this book, a publishing consultant said I should write a popular book, and and so I had visions of me and Colbert, and I couldn't do it really, because I really want to theorize it, but I think it's important to somehow convey to a broader audience that we need to question why we have succumbed to this panic around childhood. And why there's all of these management strategies, this diagnosing, this pharmaceuticalization, Stephen and Peter were talking about allergy, now we have peanut allergies up the wazoo. Nobody was allergic to a peanut, 50 years ago. And now you can't even have a peanut on a plane because somebody might die in the 17th row. And I don't mean, sorry if any of you have peanut allergies, but there's something that's conjured about this panic. And I think it's, like all fear talk, it's about distraction, and it's not in proportion to dangers to children, the real dangers to children. We all know, statistically and otherwise, are in their homes. The real dangers to children are childhood poverty and malnourishment and violence in the streets. It's not the things that we're meant to attend to and manage. And so, you know, the PR person at my university encourages me to write, you know, some op-ed piece for the New York Times that they won't accept, but I haven't tried. I'm bad at that.
Other questions?
There's somebody. Oh.
I'm just wondering, there's been reference to this alarmist attitude and all the behaviors that it gives rise to, and I think in your presentation we saw that they're actually quite far-reaching and profound in the way that they impact communities and societies. Do you have any sense of the genesis of this attitude in society? I mean, do you think it was manufactured? I mean, I know you can't answer the question definitively, but you've studied this. So do you think it was deliberately manufactured? Do you think it's an outlet for something completely different? Is it a conception of the family that's evolved? I mean, I think that would shed a lot of light on how we should respond if we could think about that.
You know, I think it was a few things that came together in the 70s, declining fertility, feminism, you know, kind of increase in women's place in the workplace and economic role, that part of it is like, girls, get home, it's your fault if your children are damaged or drug addicted or this or that. Part of it was that sort of postponement of marriage and childbearing with both birth control pill and the feminist movement that led to fewer children, older parents, more educated, you know, so there's a kind of doting, an aspect of the rarity, and this was discussed this morning, this sort of precious child or, you know, children. But I also think it was just around the 80s. I think it's not insignificant in the U.S. that the kind of loss of the Vietnam War, the oil crisis, you know, there were all these things about the U.S.'s presumption of ascendance in the world. I mean, and this may be, you may think this is a crackpot theory, but it's my crackpot theory. But all of these things that shifted the ground in which Americans, at least, assumed their place in the world, their strength, their future as secure. We all know that after that time, like I'm sort of the last generation, you know, people who are in 50 or over, the last generation whose lives were better, guaranteed to be better than their parents. And so there was some kind of downturn in 1973 with the oil shocks, with the end of Vietnam in the mid-70s. And I really think people felt destabilized by the kind of end of the American century. It was a short century. And part of that produced this sort of deep insecurity. And also the shift in family form, increased divorce, later, you know, the things I mentioned also. And so it kind of created a sort of perfect storm. I don't think it was contrived in that, you know, I mean, the Trilateral Commission is capable of anything, but I don't think they were sitting there saying, let's get everyone scared about their children. But I do think that these panics took hold. You know, there's been kidnapping, it's incredibly rare, that's caused waves of panic over the 20th century, but all of a sudden this sense of like danger to children really took hold in a way that I think really speaks about a deeper insecurity And now I think the management response, I really, I've written about this as managing children and managing childhood, but I think others have written about managing bodies, so diet, surgery, exercise, like I am gonna take care of what I can take care of, because I cannot take care of this whole crazy world that is threatening to, blow our brains out. And it always could have, but there's somehow something that really produces this insecurity.